Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us. My name is Daniel Horan, and I'm professor of philosophy, religious studies, and theology, and I have the distinct privilege of serving as the director of the Center for Spirituality here at St. Mary's College. And I am delighted to welcome you to this event sponsored by the Center for Spirituality. Founded in 1984 with the generous support from the Sisters of the Holy Cross, the Center for Spirituality offers programs that promote the engagement between faith and reason and the connection between mind, body, and spirit. A hub for scholarly and public engagement, we draw on intellectual resources in the Catholic and Christian heritage, as well as how individuals practice faith in their daily lives to develop critical conversations around contemporary religious issues, especially as they relate to women's experiences in society, the academy, and the church. Before we proceed with our exciting event this afternoon, we wish to acknowledge that St. Mary's College and the Center for Spirituality here are located on sacred land, and to honor the native peoples who have been the traditional custodians of this place for generations. We particularly recognize the Pogagon Band of Potawatomi and the Miami, who have cared for this land and its resources for many generations and continue to do so today. With deep gratitude, we recognize these native peoples and their cultures within our community, as well as acknowledging the land upon which we gather, pray, learn, and work, and which many of you are joining us virtually. Before I introduce our distinguished speaker, I just want to offer a few instructions. We'll have an opportunity for some questions and answers, some virtual discussion. And I invite you at the bottom of your screen to enter your questions or comments into the Q&A box. You'll see a button there. Feel free to do that, or if you're more comfortable, feel free to enter your questions or comments into the chat box. I'll be monitoring that and facilitating the conversation after Dr. Cummings offers her formal presentation. And now it's my honor to welcome our distinguished speaker this afternoon. Kathleen Sprose Cummings is Professor of American Studies and History at the University of Notre Dame, where she also serves as the William W. and Anna Jean Cushwa Director of the Cushwa Center for the Study of American Catholicism. She holds a concurrent appointment in the Department of Theology, and she is an affiliated faculty member in Gender Studies, Italian Studies, and the Nanovic Institute for European Studies. Cummings' most recent book, titled A Saint of Our Own, How the Quest for a Holy Hero Helped Catholics Become American, was published by the University of North Carolina Press in 2019. She's also the author of the book, New Women of the Old Faith, Gender and American Catholicism in the Progressive Era, as well as numerous scholarly articles and book chapters, including a very important article published in the most recent issue of Notre Dame magazine. More on that in a bit. Dr. Cummings teaches classes on the history of women, Catholicism, and American religion at the University of Notre Dame. In addition to directing the Cushwa Center, Dr. Cummings oversees the Conference on the History of Women Religious, which is an academic organization devoted to the historical study of Catholic sisters, and they are hosting at the University of Notre Dame and at St. Mary's College a conference this coming June. More about that on the Cushwa Center website. So without further ado, let us virtually give a wonderful St. Mary's College warm welcome to Dr. Cummings, who's going to speak to us today on the topic, Monumental Women, Remembering Catholic Sisters at Notre Dame and in America. Dr. Kathy Cummings, welcome.
Thank you so much, Dan, for that wonderful introduction and also for the invitation to speak here this afternoon. I would obviously love to be on campus, as will become very clear. I love to visit St. Mary's campus across the street and do so as often as I can. And I was thinking about the fact that I am so often an audience member at talks at St. Mary's, whether through the Center for Spirituality or other venues. And I was thinking about from the time I attended my first Madaleva lecture as a doctoral student at Notre Dame in the late 1990s until attending President Convoy's inauguration last October. I was just, and all the many, many times in between, I was just thinking about how much I've learned as an audience member. I'm not often a speaker at St. Mary's, and I'm certainly delighted to be so today. And I remember very fondly another time I spoke under the auspices of the Center for Spirituality, and that was in 2009. Sister Kathleen Dolphin, who was then the director, invited me to give the 25th anniversary lecture for the center. And it was a wonderful experience for me. And I wanted to start there. I'm going to share my screen. And one of the reasons I remember it so well is because Kathleen and I, we collaborated on many things, but never we never had more fun, or I think more impact, than when we co-sponsored Women in Spirit, Catholic Sisters in America. That was a traveling exhibit sponsored by the Smithsonian Institution, funded by many donors, in particular Conrad Hilton Foundation. And it traveled the United States for 3 years, going to some of the most prominent museums in the country. The Smithsonian, the Ellis Island Statue of Liberty Museum, museums in California, in Texas, and right here at our Center for History in downtown South Bend. And it was co-sponsored by Notre Dame and by St. Mary's College. Perhaps some of you in the audience saw this exhibit. If you did, you'll remember how remarkable it was for integrating the story of Catholic sisters into the larger American experience. From 1727, with the Ursulines' arrival in New Orleans, really up to the present day. And it was just truly remarkable. This gives me a really good starting point. That exhibit was temporary. It was always designed to be so. But my topic for today is how we think about Catholic sisters in the American commemorative landscape. And we think about that both on a national level, and I'm going to toggle back and forth between the American story and the local story of remembering Catholic sisters. And by local, I mean to say St. Mary's College, and this is a bit of a spoiler alert, which does an excellent job of remembering the history of Catholic sisters, not surprisingly, and the University of Notre Dame, which does not do so great of a job marking the history of Catholic sisters. So with that intro, let me start by zooming out and thinking first about the American story. Now, of course, the backdrop for all of this is we are in the midst of a serious national conversation about monuments, and in particular, monument removal, particularly those related to people who participated in slavery. And these debates can often be polarizing, contentious, and I have to say that as a historian, they can be somewhat demoralizing. This meme started circulating a couple of years ago in the midst of rather heated debates about Confederate monuments and removing them, how that was somehow tantamount to erasing history, which, as historians know, is not the case. Monuments are not history. Monuments tell always a limited part of the story. They never tell the whole story. And studying history, as the scholar here in front of her computer suggests, is complex. And I think if you add a lot more books and things, you could get an idea of what I feel like at my desk sometimes. Now, although this can be disheartening, the way that history is bandied about in the public sphere, obviously this conversation we're having about our commemorative landscape and about what it signifies is not only important, but it's also leading to wonderful changes and really interesting things. The Mellon Foundation, for example, funded a study by the Monument Lab in Philadelphia that conducted what it called a national monument audit. And this is a little bit about the process here. I have the website linked, but you can also just Google it. It's a wealth of information. And it talked about, it did an assessment of who are the people in America's commemorative landscape, who are the top people, and what does it signify? And it defined monument broadly, not just only as what we conventionally think of in terms of statues or things like that, but buildings and bridges and sites, markers, place names. A key to the findings is that the lab defines a monument as a statement of power and presence in public. And I want to emphasize that because that's part of what I'm interested in. Putting a monument up is a statement of power. And that's how we are going to approach it today. Now, this study revealed all sorts of fascinating things. And of course, I'm not going to be able to do it justice. Some of the findings relate very much to our national conversation about race. Of the top 50 individuals commemorated in the monument audit, 50% of them enslaved other people. That relates to the Confederate monuments and things like that. So that's obviously a part of an important conversation. The one I'm focused on, though, is what monuments reveal about gender, and in particular about women. And some of the tidbits uncovered in this monument, I mean, it's really, they'd be funny if they weren't so appalling. So, for example, did you know that there are 22 recorded monuments in America dedicated to mermaids, while only 2 are devoted to US Congresswomen. So you can see what I'm talking about. There's a problem here in terms of representation of women in general. These are some of the key findings highlighted in the report. Monuments have always changed. The monument landscape is overwhelmingly white and male. Of the top 50 individuals, only 3 are women. The most common features of American monuments reflect war and conquest. And the key finding is that the story of the United States is told by our current monuments isn't an accurate version of our history. And so part of the impetus behind this project is to fix that. And that is within our power to do that. Here is a representation of those top 50 that the Monument Lab uncovered. If we were in person, feel free to drop in the chat any comments. The first 5, well, the first 4 I think are very recognizable. Number 5, and I'm not making this up. This is not just for Father Dan, but number 5 is Francis of Assisi. He is the 5th most represented person in the American commemorative landscape. To find a woman, we have to go to number 18. Does anybody recognize her? Anyone want to drop it in the chat? It's not a conventionally, it's not a well-known picture of this woman, although she's certainly very well known. But number 18 right here is Joan of Arc, another Catholic saint. So yes, and I see in the chat where after Joan of Arc, we have our 2 other women. We have Harriet Tubman, who is right here, and Sacagawea. So those are the 3 women recorded in the top 50 U.S. Top 50 individuals recorded in U.S. public monuments. I just want to note that Catholic saints are represented fairly well. In addition to St. Joan of Arc and St. Francis of Assisi, we have St. Paul right there, and also Junipero Serra, so another Franciscan. His placement there probably owes a great deal to his, Serra was a Franciscan missionary who founded many of the missions in California. And he's also among the most recent, is the most recently canonized US saint. So it's not surprising to find this overlap because Catholics name things after their saints. And this monument is tracking not just statues, but also names and various things like that. So obviously, I think this visual really is telling. It communicates just how white and male the landscape is. But the Mellon Foundation and other people working in this area are using this as a call to action, and the landscape is changing. Just in the last week, a statue of Harriet Tubman, so someone already in the top 50, was unveiled at Philadelphia City Hall. It's a temporary exhibit. It'll be there throughout February and March, which are consecutively Black History Month and Women's History Month. I love this monument. I love the movement that it evokes. And it also reminds me of a monument that's erected to a woman who is not in the top 50, another Catholic saint, but someone who is up and coming, I think, on the commemorative landscape, and that is St. Frances Cabrini. This was a statue of her that was unveiled on Columbus Day, last Columbus Day, October of 2020, and it's at Battery Park in Manhattan. It's a wonderful sculpture. I think it shows her in a paper boat, which, if you know Frances Cabrini's story, she grew up in northern Italy, envisioning herself as a missionary to China, and she used to put violets in paper boats and pretend they were missionaries sailing off. So she didn't go to China. She came to New York and eventually traveled all over the United States, in addition to places in South America and all over Europe. Had 67 foundations by the time she died at the age of 67. But US Catholics and Americans in general claim her in a special way because she became a naturalized citizen of the United States, and in 1946 became the first US citizen to be canonized a saint. Cabrini is enjoying a lot of attention. 2017 was the 100th anniversary of her death. Pope Francis although Pope Francis doesn't really think of her as an American, Pope Francis knew about Cabrini from the foundations of her sisters in Argentina. But he cites her quite often as a saint, a missionary to the migrants. And here she is pictured with two children who are presumably migrants. But she is getting a lot of attention, in part related to the downfall of Columbus, number 3 person in the top 50 monuments, as Columbus Day has fallen out of favor. And Columbus Day has often, in some communities, has been renamed, Indigenous Peoples Day, for example. But Colorado in 2020 took a step of actually renaming Columbus Day Cabrini Day, made it a state holiday. It became Colorado became the first state in the union to have a paid state holiday named after a woman. And it's celebrated for the second time this past October, Cabrini Day. It's interesting because Cabrini named many of her first foundations in the United States after Columbus Hospital in New York, Columbus Hospital in Chicago. And after her death, they were renamed in her honor. So the Columbus to the Cabrini trajectory is not something that's new, but I expect she's going to rise up in the number of representations. This was part of an initiative called She Built NYC. It's a deliberate attempt on the part of New York to include more women in its public landscape. So again, this is New York and Colorado, but it's happening in other cities. If we go to the top 15 women represented in the monument audit, shown in the monument audit, we do see St. Elizabeth Seton appearing in that list of the top 15, pretty far down on the overall list. But this reflects the fact that Seton was not the first American citizen to be canonized, but the first American-born saint. And almost every diocese in the United States has something named after Seton, a parish or a school. Dan mentioned my book in my introduction, and that's how she got to be on my cover. The book is actually about all American saints, but she is kind of has pride of place in some ways because of her ubiquitousness, and which explains why she surfaced in that monument lab. I want to talk now, though, about what I believe is the most significant monument dedicated to Catholic sisters, permanent monuments. There's only one sister in the top 15 women, as we've seen. So the most significant monument doesn't honor one sister, but actually 12 sisters, and collectively almost 1,000 Catholic sisters who nursed in the Civil War. This ties directly into one of the findings of the monument, that the most common features of American monuments reflect war and conquest. So these are Catholic sisters participating in a war. This is a picture of the nuns of the battlefield monuments. And I know that I saw the participant list. I believe we have some members of the Ladies Ancient Order of Hibernians on this call, and that's absolutely wonderful. They were the sponsors of this memorial, which is located at the corner of Rhode Island and M Street in Washington, D.C., right near St. Matthew's Cathedral, directly opposite. It was designed by Jerome O'Connor, who was an Irish-born artist known for his lifelike portraits in bronze. And it was dedicated on September 20th, 1924. There are life-size figures of 12 sisters representing communities of women religious. Ultimately, there were about 21 congregations that supplied nurses for the Civil War, including, of course, the Sisters of the Holy Cross, as well as Sisters of Mercy, Sisters of St. Joseph, Dominicans, and the Daughters of Charity at Emmitsburg, actually a congregation founded by Elizabeth Ann Seton, provided the largest number, and they were well known. Emmitsburg was not very far away from Gettysburg, so they nursed during that momentous battle. Here's a close-up of the panel, as well as the inscriptions that appear on the top and the bottom. You have to go around to the back of the panel to see that it was funded and by the Ladies Auxiliary of the Ancient Order of Hibernians. It's also flanked, as you could see in the previous picture, by two allegorical figures on either end: the Angel of Patriotism on the north end and the Angel of Peace on the south. I want to talk now a little bit about how this memorial came to be, because it was really the work and related to the work and dedication of a single woman whose name was Ellen Ryan Jolly. She's pictured here, not a very good picture, but the best that I could find. Ellen Jolly was the American-born daughter of Irish immigrants, and she had been taught in her native Rhode Island by the Sisters of Mercy. And from them, she heard a great deal about nursing sisters in the Civil War. When she became president of the Ladies Auxiliary to the AOH, an organization that has dropped the term auxiliary, but still exists today, and I should acknowledge is a wonderful benefactor of the Cushel Center, which I direct. But when she became president, she proposed to the National Assembly that there be a national monument dedicated to the sisters who nursed in the Civil War, the Catholic sister nurses. Jolly was, now this was a time, this is 1914. This is at the, by the 20th century, many of the veterans of the Civil War had begun to die. This was a time when the Great War was on the horizon. There was a time when Civil War memory was very much in the American conversation. And Jolly was motivated by what she saw as an injustice. The sisters, the American Red Cross received a monument in Washington, D.C. Was approved in 1912. And she felt that while women nursing under secular auspices should, of course, be honored, and women like Clara Barton deserved honor, but she also wanted the Catholic sisters, whose work was often hidden and not talked about, to have their space in the nation's capital as well. And she was also motivated by the knowledge that many of the Civil War chaplains, including Holy Cross priests like William Corby, who's pictured here, a statue of him that appeared, that was erected in Gettysburg in 1910, and an exact replica was erected outside of Corby Hall at Notre Dame, where it still stands today, although it's recently been flipped. The renovations of Corby Hall had to be removed for a while, and they switched them. He used to face south, he faces east. But in any case, Jolly believed that if the women under secular auspices who nursed and the Catholic chaplains, the male chaplains who served, were recognized, that Catholic sisters should have their due as well. And she went about doing as much as she could to see that happening. She really is an amazing, a lot of energy and some very impressive historical work. By her reckoning, she estimated that about 90% of Civil War nurses had either been born in Ireland or were daughters of Irish immigrants. She may have overestimated a little bit on the list of Holy Cross sisters. There are 63 verified sisters, Holy Cross sisters, that served in the Civil War. Approximately 51 of those, or about 80%, were born in Ireland. Certainly more were probably the children, the daughters of Irish immigrants. But in any case, she believed this was the perfect project for the Ladies Auxiliary to the Ancient Order of Hibernians. The War Department stipulated that absolute proof of service rendered by nuns, that it had to be verified. So Jolly wrote and visited many, many congregations to try to get that proof, and was able to come up with that list. She, in the process, became very good friends with Father John Kavanaugh, who was president of the University of Notre Dame at the time, and in fact, her son enrolled at the University of Notre Dame. And she enlisted Kavanaugh in her efforts, and Kavanaugh, who was very proud of his own Irish heritage, was involved in the Corby Memorial and other initiatives, was very happy to support her. Jolly originally wanted the monument to be in Arlington Cemetery, but there were some problems with that. The War Department was resisting that, and Jolly finally withdrew her resistance and agreed to look for another site, which wound up being the site on M Street. In 1918, on the Feast of St. Bridget, which Jolly viewed as very significant, a bill was introduced into the House of Representatives to secure this monument, and it passed on the Feast of St. Patrick, so another sign. And President Wilson signed it into law on Good Friday of that year, 1918. That same year, Kavanaugh, as a way to congratulate Jolly, awarded her an honorary degree of laws at Notre Dame's commencement in 1918. And for a long time, she was the only woman to have received an honorary degree from the University of Notre Dame. And she was very, very proud of that, as she should have been. This is a picture of her. This is the dedication of the monument in 1924. Boston's Cardinal O'Connell is speaking, and Jolly is pictured here. She spoke at the event. She's wearing her academic garb. She also always used her honorary degree title. And here is a first edition of the book, Nuns of the Battlefield, which she published in 1927, chronicling the experience of 21 different congregations nursing in the Civil War. And this is actually a signed copy that she gave to the University of Notre Dame. I want to move now from the national, this story, to the local. Not long after she received her first degree, and I haven't tracked down the exact sequence of when she did this precisely, but in the course of working for this national monument, Jolly discovered that the War Department, by federal law, was required to provide a grave marker for any veteran or enlisted nurse if they weren't buried in Arlington. So she was able to secure grave markers for Catholic sisters all over the country and at the University of Notre Dame and at St. Mary's. In November of 1919, she came to South Bend for a ceremony at St. Mary's College. And this is just a picture I took of one of the most interesting stories of the 63 Civil War nurses in the Congregation of Holy Cross. Sister M. Lydia, born Mary Margaret Clifford in Ireland. And Sister Lydia not only nursed in the Civil War, but she nursed in the Spanish-American War as well. And that's actually what this plaque says. Sister Mary Lydia Clifford, nurse, U.S. Army, Spanish-American War. There were about 50 of those plaques shipped to St. Mary's College, and you can see them today, not only honoring Civil War sisters and Spanish-American War, but also World War I. What I don't know is there are also plaques in the Holy Cross Cemetery at Notre Dame for those who served as chaplains, and I'm not sure when they were. They look a little different, and I'm not sure if Jolly was behind that too. Certainly, Kavanaugh would have supported that. I learned most of what I know about this ceremony. I learned from a doctoral student of mine, former doctoral student named Andrew Mock, who wrote a wonderful dissertation on this topic. And he has a detail of the ceremony in which these markers were dedicated. And he has a quote from Kavanaugh saying, honoring Jolly and thanking Jolly, he singled out one member of the Ladies' Ancient Order of Hibernians. This is a quote: herself the mother of sons, she has always been a true nun at heart, an eloquent and zealous high priestess of faith and patriotism. Though for reasons of delicacy, he said, I may not mention her name. So this brings me across the street to the University of Notre Dame, where, as we can see, Kavanaugh was very concerned about women's delicacy and very resistant to the idea of monuments being dedicated to a woman. This is a quote from him in 1916. He was giving a homily at the funeral of Sister Mary Aloysius, born Honora Mulcair, also in Ireland. Someone has asked, he said, why the world has never erected a monument to any woman. The answer is that every great man that has ever lived is himself a monument to some good woman. He went on to talk about Sister Aloysius and how she had such remarkable intellectual ability that she might have been president of the United States. Instead, she taught Notre Dame's minims or grammar school students for over 40 years at St. Edward's Hall. According to Kavanaugh, only Sorin himself, the founder, had given more years of service to Notre Dame than Sister Aloysius had. Moreover, only the founder could rival her in zeal, enthusiasm, and talent. Nevertheless, he said that she did not need a monument because her deeds would be ever etched on the hearts of men, so therefore it was unnecessary to recognize her in another way. Now, Kavanaugh felt rather differently about people like Newt Rockne. He wrote, after Rockne was killed in a plane crash, he was instrumental in publishing the autobiography of Newt Rockne and wrote the introduction. And this is a quote. He talked about Rockne as a very manly man, and led the campaign to build what is now the Rockley Memorial on campus. Manliness and religion have gone hand in hand in Notre Dame tradition, from Father Soren on down to the present generation. So I want to, the last part of my talk does focus on the University of Notre Dame and the way these ideas about manliness and the primacy of manliness is reflected in our campus commemorative landscape, which again is very different from what you see at St. Mary's College. I want to just take a little bit of a look about how women are represented on campus. And again, it ties very closely into the larger story. Frances Cabrini is, there's an etching to her on the facade of X School of Law. It's not an image of her, but an image that is said to represent her. I believe she loved the phrase, "The world is too small for all the good that I want to do." And there she is, presumably holding the world. We have Elizabeth Ann Seton. Here is a statue of her in Knott Hall on campus, which was not opened as a women's hall, but is now a men's hall, but there she is in the chapel. Apart from Mary, probably the most common, the most popular woman represented on the commemorative landscape is number 18 on the national list, Joan of Arc. These are the World War I memorial doors. They're known as the God Country Notre Dame doors, the east entrance of the Basilica of the Sacred Heart. They were dedicated on Memorial Day, 1924. This is an early image. You see Joan of Arc is inscribed here, but the niches were left empty until World War II, when this image was sculpted there, and St. Michael the Archangel is over there. So, so anyway, these are not the only women represented at Notre Dame, but there is a dearth of women in the commemorative landscape. And people are paying attention. The national conversation we're having about who's represented and where, and the gender implications of that are obvious to, increasingly obvious to Notre Dame students. One of them wrote me in the fall of 2020, a junior at Notre Dame. She had gone on a landscape tour with her architecture class, and she noticed that apart from Mary, there were so few representations of women, and so she wanted to have a conversation about that. And this student, and certainly I, no disrespect to Mary, the student actually talked about how obviously the Blessed Mother is wonderful and the university is named for her, but where's the diversity of women's experiences represented? So this was one of the many things that got me thinking about this, and I teach courses that are related to the history of Notre Dame and the history of gender and Catholicism. So I want to go back to Father Soren, Father Kavanaugh and Sister Aloysius for a minute. Sister Aloysius, I mentioned that she taught minims at Notre Dame for many years. And she was one of hundreds of Holy Cross sisters who lived and worked on Notre Dame's campus between 1843 and 1958. This is a story that is distinct from, of course, overlapped with the hundreds of Holy Cross sisters who lived and ministered at St. Mary's and, of course, continue to do so today. Kavanaugh and many other Holy Cross priests would say often that Notre Dame could not have developed into the university that it did without the unsubsidized, heavily subsidized labor provided by Holy Cross sisters. Nevertheless, this is a story that remains largely unknown. There are a few plaques on a series in the basement of Notre Dame's main building, the Wall of Honor, that honor Sisters of the Holy Cross. But apart from that, it's not commemorated on campus. And because of this query from the Notre Dame undergraduate, and because of a class I teach called Notre Dame in America, I started to investigate how not only is it not represented, but there is one place where this history is actually erased. I want to move now to a spot on campus that is a sacred spot, and one that many of you will recognize if you're familiar with Notre Dame's campus at all. And this is the Founders Plaque, which is located just overlooking St. Mary's Lake, right by the replica of the Lock Chapel. This is a wonderful monument in many reasons. It commemorates, it contains an excerpt from a letter that Soren wrote to his superior, Basil Moreau, on December 5th, 1842. We quote it often. This is the This is where he imagines a university that cannot fail to succeed, one that will become a powerful means for good in this country. But remember, to go back to where I opened with, monuments are a statement of power and presence. Monuments always oversimplify, and they often distort or omit. When you compare the excerpt that's etched on the founder's plaque to translations of Soren's letter to Moreau, you see that there are many things that have been left out, important things, including the story of women. This is just my attempt to reinsert some of them. He notes, for example, that it's the center of the Indian mission. I was thinking about that during Father Dan's acknowledgement at the beginning of this talk. Soren was very conscious that his new mission was in the center of that. So that's also another direction. I love this. As there is no other school within more than 100 miles, this college cannot fail to succeed. That is a wonderful, bold statement. But he adds a qualification, provided it receive assistance from our good friends in France. He meant money, he meant vocations, and he traveled often to France and to Rome to secure both. And then here, once the sisters come, a sentence that doesn't appear at all, whose presence is so much desired here, they must be prepared, not merely for domestic work, but also for teaching, and perhaps too for the establishment of an academy. Right there in the letter is the hope that sisters would come, a hope that was fulfilled the next year when 4 sisters of Holy Cross arrived on campus from Le Mans. There won't be time to talk about all of these sisters. Again, there were hundreds of them. I'll just mention 2. Mother Mary Ascension, pictured on the left here, was one of the sisters who came from France, not the original 4, but very soon after that. And she and Soren were collaborators, friends. When she died in 1901, mourners eulogized Mother Ascension as the last of Notre Dame's pioneers. She may have lived in quiet obscurity, but she had been second only to Soren in achieving the present greatness of Notre Dame. She was remembered as a person who had done her best to build a university in which there will never be any divorce between science and religion. Of course, Mother Angela Gillespie is more familiar, I think, than Mother Ascension. Her story, she was a 29-year-old woman traveling to enter the Sisters of Mercy in Chicago when Father Soren met her at Notre Dame's gate and spotted her talent and insisted that she had a vocation to the Sisters of Holy Cross. And she became also a good friend and collaborator of Father Soren's. These 2 women were at the epicenter of a conflict that is foreshadowed by this highlighted text down here. They must be prepared, the sisters, not merely for domestic work, but for teaching and perhaps too for the establishment of academy. Now, there was no doubt that Soren meant this sincerely when he wrote it, and he certainly supported Holy Cross Sisters' efforts to build an academy and purchased property where it moved to its present location. But Soren's support for the sisters' educational work extended only so far, and when it started to interfere with his own ambitions for the University of Notre Dame, it actually reached its limit. In 1872, Soren complained to the Archbishop of Cincinnati that the Sisters of the Holy Cross were so busy expanding their own educational institutions that they no longer had time to supply all the domestic needs on campus, and that he was forced to hire lay women to perform this work. So he proposed forming his own order, a separate order that would supply just the domestic needs of Notre Dame. This threat really alarmed the Sisters of Holy Cross at Notre Dame and St. Mary's. One of the women that protested vociferously was Sister Mary Margaret Gleason Compassion, who had served at Notre Dame in his early years and was then serving on the council at St. Mary's. She implored Soren to recall the firm bonds between sisters, priests, and brothers of the Holy Cross and abandon his plans to form a separate congregation. I, for one, and an Irish sister too, am much opposed to the separation. As much as I love St. Mary's, I'd be willing to spend the rest of my life at ND if by so doing I could preserve the union. Mother Compassion had served as a Civil War nurse, so that language was very significant. In any case, a compromise was reached and Soren eventually backed down. The Sisters of Holy Cross agreed in a counterproposal to send enough sisters to supply Notre Dame's domestic needs, even though it required them to hire more outside help at St. Mary's. This episode, which is familiar certainly to, I know there are Sisters of Holy Cross in the audience, and certainly familiar in congregational history. And it divided and hurt the sisters. It certainly does not reflect positively on Sorin, but it's hardly unique. He was the ecclesiastical superior of a group of women who struggled to operate for their own autonomy and to make their own decisions about their ministries, their finances, and their leaders. A monumental step for the Sisters of the Holy Cross was the election of Mother Augusta Anderson as the first American Superior General in 1889, also a nurse in the Civil War. And she was able to secure eventually permanent recognition of the Sisters of Holy Cross constitutions, and also afford them independence from Notre Dame. Now, that said, the sisters continued to live and work on Notre Dame's campus until 1958. Independence did not mean that they weren't devoted to Notre Dame. And in fact, the history of the two campuses are very intermingled in ways that I don't think we understand very well at Notre Dame. At a mass marking the departure of sisters, those final sisters in 1958, President Theodore Hesburgh assured them that they and their predecessors would never be forgotten by Notre Dame administrators, faculty, and students. You have been, he told them, the golden threads woven forever in the tapestry of Notre Dame's life. And yet they were forgotten. This story has largely been forgotten. As Notre Dame is about to mark the 50th anniversary of undergraduate coeducation, I think it's really important to remember that the undergraduates directly admitted to Notre Dame in fall 1972 were not even close to being the first women on campus. And in fact, when Curry Temple, the editor of Notre Dame magazine, approached me to ask me to write an article for the upcoming issue devoted to coeducation, I told him that what I really wanted to do was write an article about the women who arrived on campus in 1843 and the hundreds of their Holy Cross sisters who followed them. He obliged, was very happy to do it, and that article was published in the most recent issue. Dan, maybe you want to drop a link to that article in the chat. This certainly tells more of the story than I was able to tell today, but even the article itself just barely scratches the surface of this story that, as I said, has not only been forgotten, but if we look at the founder's plaque as an example, has actually been erased, has been removed from the landscape. At a ceremony marking the end of a mass, marking the end of the departure ceremony in 1958, Father Arthur Hope wrote a remarkable document that remembered the sisters' 115 years of service and asked these Sisters of the Holy Cross, who from an economic point of view have given so much and asked so little, how shall we remember them? I want to end by going back to these key findings of the monument audit. Monuments have always changed. They're very fluid. It makes sense. As we change, as a society, as our priorities change, as our knowledge increases, we change our representations. And it's a reminder that monuments can change, that we have the power to do that. It was announced recently that Coach Muffet McGraw is going to have a statue on Notre Dame's campus. That's amazing and long overdue. But of course, it's not enough, and it's not a zero-sum game. Just putting a statue of one prominent woman doesn't mean that we shouldn't have more of them. And so this is something I've heard from a lot of alums, mostly alumni of Notre Dame after this article was published, thinking about how can we do this? How can we make this happen? It is in our power to create a different kind of commemorative landscape. And I think I'd be really interested to hear people's ideas of how that could happen. I think that, the original title of this article, my title, of the article that appeared in Notre Dame magazine, it was published under the title, The Women of Past Presence. But my original title was, which I still like better, was Sins of Omission. Because I actually think it does rise to the level of sin, forgetting. And what would it be like if we consciously chose to remember a different story? What if we had a more inclusive founders plaque at Notre Dame that acknowledged the plurality and the diversity of the people who made Notre Dame what it is today? What if the university thought about this episode, which again doesn't reflect very positively on the founder, but it's not unique to him, and it is part of the way institutions grow, and how we can remember difficult aspects of our past. How can it can help us direct our imaginations to a different future. I want to end with a name of certainly Sisters of the Holy Cross will recognize this name, but of a woman named Sister Agnella O'Sullivan, also born in Ireland. I think that there are wonderful, towering women, Sisters of the Holy Cross in Notre Dame's history, like Mother Ascension, like Mother Angela, like many, like Sister Aloysius, many others. But I think of those hundreds of them, and I wonder how their story can be remembered. Sister Agnella spent almost half a century editing the Scholastic, the student magazine on Notre Dame's campus. She's really important to me. I use the Scholastic all the time. It's a wonderful archival source, and yet there's really no means to remember her. And I think about all the sisters who did this kind of work that is hidden, the essential workers of the church, if you will, and how we don't have the mechanism to name them, to remember them. And that's a conversation that I hope we can have today, but I hope it leads to broader conversation. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Dr. Cummings. That was fantastic. And I can tell already from the questions that are coming in, from the comments that have been entered into the chat, that I'm not the only one who is deeply engaged in this history and in this presentation. We have about 13 minutes or so left in the hour. So we'll take this opportunity to pose some questions to you and share some comments that are coming in from our participants here. But I thought I might begin with a question of my own, and that is a question of parity. So, you mentioned that the Notre Dame magazine invited you to write this piece on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of co-education at the university. And I can't help but think about other developments historically in that period, including the passage of Title IX, which of course granted equity in offerings to men and women, I think most famously in sports on campus. And I'm curious if there was such a Title IX like commission for monuments or representation at the University of Notre Dame, who are some of your, let's say, top 5 figures that should be represented in addition to Coach Moffat?
Well, I mentioned some of them today. I mentioned, and I should have thanked the sisters at the archives of congregational records at Holy Cross, who've been amazing in supplying me with information about Mother Ascension and Sister Lydia, and about really anything that I ask. It can be hard for someone who's not a member of the religious community to access the records of them, and they've been wonderful. Although there's often so frustratingly little we can find to really round out the story of who they were. So yeah, I would start with this is probably Mother Ascension, this woman who I think was a genius. She actually when she entered, she wanted to come on the American mission, which she had read about, but her superiors in France actually wanted to keep her because they envisioned her as a future leader there. But Soren convinced the congregation to let her come with him, and I think really played a significant role in ways that we really don't know yet. I think I also want to say it's not only the Sisters of Holy Cross, that's what I focused on, but there have been sisters studying at Notre Dame, receiving degrees from Notre Dame since 1918 from many, many different congregations. A colleague of mine in the archives, Elizabeth Hogan, is writing an article about that for Notre Dame magazine, about the other sisters. There are many women in there. Certainly some of the pioneers of coeducation. I think about Sister Jean Lenz, who is someone that I knew well, but who was hired by, persuaded, she was a Joliet Franciscan, to come and help with the transition to coeducation, which was rough for a lot of these women. So yeah, I have a big list, but I'd love to hear what others think.
So a couple of comments have come in already, in comments of gratitude, but also affirmation of what you've shared from personal experiences, acknowledging, with sadness, the erasure of of the sisters' history and presence and contributions across the strait at the University of Notre Dame. But here's a question. One of them, one comment is, it's actually really a question: how many people are aware that Mother Mary on the Golden Dome was a gift from the Holy Cross Sisters? You're a faculty member at Notre Dame, teach undergrads. Is that something the students are aware of?
Well, they are in my classes now. I learned fairly recently, and that's, yeah, I mean, Soren, yeah, and I focused on an episode of discord between them, but the sisters were tremendously helpful to Soren. And so he wanted the Golden Dome in real gold. He did not want, and his council wouldn't approve it because it was a major expense. So he kind of decamped and went to St. Mary's, and basically they agreed to pay for it and to give him what he wanted. So yeah, so here the iconic space at Notre Dame, the sisters are there. The grotto is also almost certainly, Father Corby promised he'd build a grotto if a certain favor was answered. And the timing really suggested very strongly that that favor was that the Sisters of Holy Cross be permitted to stay on campus. There was a separate novitiate and a separate convent where the sisters lived at Notre Dame. And that was highly unusual to have two of those so close together, so proximate. But he was given permission to that and built the grotto. So it's very likely that that's also another iconic space on campus. So that's what I meant about this intermingled history in ways that we just really don't appreciate, I think, on either campus today.
There's a question here. Do you, or how do you think the memorialization of the Sisters of the Holy Cross, and we might add, or that absence of memorialization, is related to the perception of St. Mary's College on Notre Dame's campus? Do you see that influencing, I think the questioner is asking, the relationship perspectively from Notre Dame across the street to St. Mary's?
Oh, absolutely. And I think about, so I mentioned the one student, who noticed, the Notre Dame student who noticed the absence of women in general. But imagine if there were Sisters of the Holy Cross commemorated at various spaces on campus. That would be something that would be good for everyone on this campus, but it would also demonstrate to the women of St. Mary's that Notre Dame is their campus too. The tri-campus community, it would actualize that. I think there should be a lot of mingling. And I don't know, maybe there's, there's lots of ways we could cooperate that, but absolutely. I think since the failure of the merger, which is what led to Notre Dame coeducation, there has been this sense that that these are two separate entities, and that's absolutely changing. I think that there's so many ways. I mean, I talk personally about how much I love and how often I come to St. Mary's, and I think there's so much back and forth right now. But that landscape and the way we tell our history doesn't always reflect that. So yeah, I think that's one of the many good things that could come out of a more inclusive landscape, a landscape that's more inclusive of the Sisters of Holy Cross contribution.
When I think that picks up on some of the sentiment that's being shared by some of our alumni here at St. Mary's. One mentioned that she's a member of the 50th anniversary class of St. Mary's College, and mentioned that reunion class here at St. Mary's. And she says, "I wonder if this becomes a joint effort for a monument that could help heal the division between Notre Dame and St. Mary's since coeducation began in 1972, which I think speaks to what you were saying, that it benefits not only St. Mary's and Notre Dame independently, but together. And along a similar line, one of our commenters shared that after reading that article that you wrote, a few of my dear alumni discussed the possibility of raising money for the erection of statues. I am a long-standing donor to Notre Dame. When I first donated at the Soren Society level, was my hope to donate to a woman-focused society. I was told there weren't any. There still aren't any. I believe it's time to begin a giving society, and parenthetically, one that still gives football tickets, named after one of the nuns and devoted to all causes related to women at Notre Dame or women of Notre Dame. I don't know if you want to respond to any of that.
Just with an enthusiastic, absolutely, yes. I mean, the Soren Society, the O'Hara Society, just do a search for all the different, there's plenty of places to give. They are the Kavanaugh Society. What if we rename the Kavanaugh Society the Sister Aloysius Society? I mean, maybe say, now, Father Kavanaugh, it is time to recognize a woman. What about Compassion Scholars, named after Mother Mary Compassion Gleason? What a beautiful, evocative name that is. The woman who so loved her country as a Civil War nurse, wanted to preserve the Union, but so loved her congregation, didn't want it cleaved by this thing. So I think there's multiple opportunities, and yes, I think they should be created. It is. There is at present, no, there's one group called Hesburgh Women of Impact, which does excellent work at Notre Dame, but really that's not what this is about. And I think that there's multiple opportunities. And I hope, as I said, this is a conversation we're having nationally, and why not have it on our campuses as well? And I think a lot of good could come out of it.
There's another question here from one of our attendees. They write, "It's my understanding that Notre Dame students now have some kind of immersion into Holy Cross spirituality, perhaps as first-year students." And they add, "It would be nice to include the sisters' history at Notre Dame as part of the course provided to the students." Not to put you on the spot as a history professor with affiliation in theology, where those spirituality courses are, I'm sure, offered, but do you have any response to that?
Yeah, absolutely. So she's referring to the Moreau first-year classes, which are, and they are relatively new. Within the last decade, they replaced the longstanding federal physical education requirement. And yes, they are focused on Holy Cross spirituality. I think I would actually like to see more history, just history being incorporated into that. And I think they could do a better job of doing that, just based on what I hear from my students. And so, yeah, that would be one place that students could encounter this history, this fuller history, right at the beginning, as soon as they get on campus.
Well, we're coming up on time, and so there are lots of wonderful comments and questions that are coming in the chat and through the Q&A button. But I thought I might offer a question that may be on the mind of many folks who read your really wonderful article in Notre Dame Magazine, which is sort of a behind-the-scenes question. What has the response been from different constituencies? What is the response on campus from alums of Notre Dame, from alumnae of St. Mary's, from the sisters, from the priests and brothers? Anything surprising, anything interesting? I'm sure we all would like to hear how that's being received.
Oh, well, it's been received well. Dan, when people read and engage your work, there's nothing more gratifying than that. And I will say that some of the most disheartening ones have come from, they're encouraging on the one hand, but they're from people who say, I want to donate and I want to join the movement. And I have to explain that presently there is no movement. There is my article, which again only scratches the surface, and that this is something that we need to build. But again, to return to what I talked about, this is something that it is within our power. Monuments change, landscapes change, they change according to priorities. And so how can we get these ideas out there in people that have more power than we do, really, to change it? So I'm certainly willing to do whatever I can as a historian and as someone who obviously feels very passionately about this. But ultimately, there needs to be broader investment. So yeah, it's been very gratifying, and I'm reading some of these enthusiastic ones. I see Gail Mandel is in the and mentions the Graduate School of Sacred Theology. Yes, a story that deserves to be told much more widely. That's also part of this intermingled history. I wish we could just do a better job of recreating just how often people traveled back and forth between our two campuses, how integral they were to each other. So yeah, I'm just seeing all of the comments now. Thank you all for engaging with this, and thank you, Dan, for the invitation. It's just a real pleasure. I do wish that I could physically be at St. Mary's, but how wonderful that so many people were able to join, including my parents from Pennsylvania. So.
Well, greetings to them. And you'd mentioned in your opening remarks that the last time you spoke at the center was for our 25th anniversary. And the good historian that you are, you reminded me the other day that we're quickly approaching our 40th anniversary in a couple years. So we will be sure to have you back in person.
Well, 2024 will be the 100th anniversary of the Nuns of the Battlefield Monument. So perhaps that's something you might not, you're the director of the center, but that might be something you might want to think to build into that because, and the cemetery on campus is really just a wonderful place to visit, but you can see those 50 grave markers to the sisters who served in Civil War, Spanish American War, and World War One. So just an idea.
Great idea. And as we begin to wrap up here, I also want to acknowledge my colleague Chris put in a comment and a question too, which I think is worth us all thinking about moving forward too, which is when thinking of the history with the sisters, are there sisters that we could speak about or study or share their legacy with other diverse backgrounds, sisters that come from places other than Europe that have made an impact? And I think as the congregation has become more a global community, that is more and more the case, both at Notre Dame and at St. Mary's. So thank you, Chris, for that very timely and important reminder. And with that, I am going to officially thank you, Dr. Kathy Cummings, for what has been a wonderful presentation, and certainly commend to all of you to read the Notre Dame Magazine piece if you haven't yet. The link was in the chat. I'm also sharing again a link right now to all the events that are forthcoming in the Center for Spirituality programming, including, I'm just going to share my screen very quickly here, including tomorrow afternoon at the same bat time, same bat channel, as they used to say, the second part or second installment of our series addressing the soul sickness of racism. This time around, it'll be my turn to speak on understanding the impacts of whiteness. And next Thursday, Dr. Regina Hill, the Vice President for Inclusion and Equity here at St. Mary's, will be speaking on an anti-racism approach to allyship. As with this program, all of our programs will be offered streaming, and these will be offered in person if you're here in the South Bend area or can come to campus. So thank you again, Dr. Cummings. Thank you all who have joined us, especially the Sisters of the Holy Cross, our St. Mary's College alumni community, current students, faculty, and staff, and our friends at Notre Dame and the broader tri-campus area. I hope you all have a wonderful evening, and wishing you all the best.